Good morning. I would like first to express my gratitude to the organizer for this very interesting, stimulating meeting. And I'd like to apologize for my English, but anyway. In her introductory note to the conference, Professor Jana Blagajevich and in her speech, Silvia Marcavati pointed out one important aspect of the recent architectural debate, the lack of the concept of realism and its circulation in different cultural spheres. The starting point of my reflection is that the discourse, the approach on this subject, realism, new realism, utopia, while tracing and seizing the silent aspects of the developments and the theoretical debate of the 20th century, and in particular the post-war architecture, tend to bring little attention to some non-marginal historical roots of the phenomenon in the 20th century, roots which, among other things, allow to place the realism in the path of a broad disciplinary paths trace between 19th and 20th century. In particular, I believe quite paradoxical the relative silence which has surrounded the experience and the articulated phenomenology related to the socialist realism. The paradox concerns the historical influence of social realism. Just think of the importance of this particular phenomenon had not only in determining the architectural and urban design developments in the USSR, but also after the World War II in many parts of Eastern Europe. So, we change this imaging. Another example, pure example of socialist realism in Rostock, very interesting example of re-elaboration, and of course another aspect of this phenomenon in Warsaw. Another point is the impact of realism in Western country, and as mentioned by my colleague Silvia Mascovati in Italy, the influence it had as a cultural background of a new generation of Italian architects, such as Canella and in particular Aldo Rossi, and so on and so on. There are many reasons for this neglect of attention. Among many others, I would like to mention in general the dissociation between theoretical developments, theory of architecture, and historiographical research, but it's not so important in this case. Another obvious political reason, another point is obvious political reason aroused is the embarrassment that socialist realism aroused in the years in which, speaking in particular, but not only, of the Italian case, a new generation of master, above mentioned, close to Communist Party, so-called in their youth, when they were studying at the Politecnico of Milan, I Maestri delle Colonne, for refusing the modern movement ideas, were growing up and reaching success. Even in the socialist country, including the USSR, of course, a vision of censorship prevailed, as the realism was inextricably linked to Stalinism. While both Western and Russian scholars were engaged in the rediscovery of the avant-garde era during the 60s, moving from the 60s, no study on social realism appeared also in the Soviet Union until the years of the perestroika. In fact, we have to wait until the 70s, the 80s, to find books, some pages, Architecture d'aujourd'hui and other pages mention, the clues of an interest largely instrumental in the debates which accompany the affirmation of postmodernism in the Western world. The result has been the almost total exclusion of socialist realism from the dominant narratives, mainly linked to the canonical strengths, as can be enriched of modernity. An exclusion that continues up to now, with timid exceptions. So, by starting with these reasons, I find particularly useful and stimulating in this context, the fact to reflect on an experience that decades of historiographical research within different areas of historiography, not only history of architecture, of course, allow to understand in all its complexity, in all its richness, and, of course, ambiguity, determined by the relationship between disciplinary concepts and ideology, innovative research and formalism, and I say architectural sphere and great history, social, economy, and so on. In fact, the socialist realism in architecture and urban design, including urban design and planning, was anything but an indefinite phenomenon, as for many times even authoritative historians have claimed. Looking at the social realism, consider it not as a dogma, but as a process, for the simple reason that at the beginning, social realism was a process of research toward a new direction. During its formative years, the 30s, we can identify key aspects that define a framework of consistent approaches and devices alternative to those marking within the horizons of the modern movement a large part of the architectural experience after the World War II. Many still identify Ala Anatole Kopp, such realism with a traditionalist revival of classicism in architecture that, through its monolithic and all-pervasive tone imposed on a political level, would have annihilated even the most fertile creative strengths that had emerged in the decade immediately after the revolution. Although such an interpretive approach does cover and capture crucial points, and it's evident that the burgeoning Stalinist power and decision-making system Soviet Stalinist decision-making system did play a decisive role in these facts, it must be noted that the events were much more articulated and contradictory. The idea of bureaucratically conditioned events driven by a precise and clearly expressed stylistic polarization no longer holds true. Neither it's correct to imagine a process unleashed unidirectionally at the highest political levels and quickly and passively declined into a uniformity of design. In short, the U-turn, the transformation, what is called in Russian процесс перевоспитания, of Soviet architecture and urban design in the 30s depended neither from the application of preconceived academic formulae nor from a univocally delineated relation between politics and disciplinary culture. It was rather the result of an interaction of forces of political culture, disciplinary, ideological and social impulses combined with material constraints and technical constraints. Far from being the result of a rigid top-down theoretical determination, the socialist realism in its early training period, the most intriguing, the most interesting, is defined in a pragmatic way on many work sites of design practice and theory. Despite the influence exerted by political events, tragic political events, and pressures linked with the Stalinist dictatorship, the architectural climate under the 30s can be also interpreted and explored as the result of a rich and sophisticated cultural strategy animated by extraordinary intellectual figures, among whom may recall, for example, Alexander Gabrichevsky, He was a fine, intelligent musicologist, special close friend with Shostakovich and Zholtovsky, a member in the early post-revolutionary day of the Studio Italiano, that it's a very important pages in the history of Soviet culture, influencing in the 30s the development of architecture. Was professor at the Academy of Architecture, the highest educational institution created in the 30s to promote the theoretical and professional architecture culture in the USSR, and translated Dante and Goethe. And this cultural climate was reflected tangibly in the pages of periodicals of review like Architektura SSR, Academia Architecture, Architektura Zerubejon, and other local reviews like Architektura Leningrada and so on. A point, very important, and it's okay. I have 10 minutes, 15. Yeah, it's okay. It's a first important point, in my opinion, to define these horizons is when can we start talking about social realism in architecture, by the way. It's customary to indicate the outcome of the international competition on the Palace of Soviets and the historic resolution on the artistic and creative groups approved in April 32, or later the first Congress of Writers in 34, mentioned as the decisive steps in the affirmation of socialist realism. Actually, among the first attempts, maybe the first, to point out the ideal, one version of the ideal of realism in architecture was an article written by Alexei Nekrasov, Проблема реализма в архитектуре, published on Architektura SSR in the first issue, if I'm right, I'm not so sure, but anyway, in 34. Realism, according to Nekrasov, was an issue specifically related to the architectural style, and historically, such realism was to be found in the classical language. Constructivism and functionalist styles are not realistic, the author wrote, because they are unable to express differences, do not exhibit plasticity, they tend to unlimited space, which does not distinguish between internal and external. To be realistic, the architecture had to be understandable to the masses, had to express strength, greatness, monumentality, fulfillment, looking for an active and not imitative relationship with history. We must remember, however, that these views expressed by Nekrasov in the context of the mid-30s reflected just a vision, just a point of view, and was far from being final and conclusive. The article was part of a debate that the creation of the old union, Unified Association of Architects, contrary to a common opinion, addressed and conditioned but had not annihilated. The amplitude of the position and discussion from 33 up to 36 bore witness to a situation far from defined. In fact, in my opinion, the true premises of such realism has been laid for a long time. I'm convinced that the roots, the actual roots of the path that would lead to the such realism preceded the competition for the Palace of Soviet and the other congresses, and were somehow outside these facts, these stylistic debates, and the stylistic interests. At the beginning, it was very a practical point. The roots of such realism were, at first, in my opinion, very pragmatic. These roots did not pose questions of style, but of planning and urban strategy. The pragmatic reason, in a sense anti-utopian, resided in the resolution of the party on reconstruction of Moscow in 31, establishing clear criteria for the reconstruction of the urban areas by banning ideas and projects about the radical transformation of the existing cities that had wide resonance until then. These roots closely and inextricably bound, this is very important, the idea of realism to a precise vision of the urban form, the urban design, and its social organization. The same year also marked the beginning of the fight against egalitarism in society as a means for containing the economic and social upheaval generated by the industrialization, and so on. From the residential sphere, these guidelines spread to all sectors in architecture. The aim of overcoming the flat anonymity, the struggle against uravnilovka, of modern architecture's alliance in favor of or more expressive Verzitinist forms derived from critical references to historical repertoire, but looking as well to a synthesis of art capable to express the social role, hierarchy, and relationship of each building in the urban context. All this point became the cardinal importance both in the design and in construction of new Soviet cities and in the renovation of this existing one. Contrary to the avant-garde ideological and radical vision of the 20s, the various areas of Soviet cities were to be denoted by their functional or hierarchical symbology and position. Initially, a move against the uniformity, which was impoverished by the low level of technology widespread in the Soviet Union at the time, realism developed in different areas of design a strategic direction for the urban reconstruction, in a perspective that rejected utopianism and radicalism in the avant-garde, in the sense of conceived by the avant-garde vision. Essential aspect of this realism, the very key point, essential aspect of this realist perspective was the affirmation and the continuity between the new urban settlements and tissues and the core, the historic city, against the tabula rasa ideology of emerging modern movement, focused on the concept of compact city and the coordinated design of different parts of the urban area, ensemblevaya zestroika. You see. Focused on its most basic urban element, the quartal, the close superblock. It's the Sots realism, the quartal, and the compact city. The residential courtyard complex, whose ex novo construction or reconstruction was at the core of Stalinist urban transformations. The basic matrix in the post-war years spread, this basic matrix spread in Eastern Europe. Stalin and so on. In connection with these goals, realism in practice was also the result of the radical reorganization of professional system through the creation of state studios placed in competition against one another and under the direction of the conscious leaders, the leading designers, Zholtovsky, Shusov, Famin, but also Mielnikov, up to the time of this removal in 1936 from professional scene. Moscow, of course, was the reference case of this strategy. Rather than deny, erase, or simply leave to its own dissolution, as advocated by many exponents of the avant-garde movement, constructivists, Moscow's historical circular radius urban plan, as well known, received prominence and was emphasized through a series of grandiose work concentrated around the Kremlin, along the river, and the west side, in the westward, and other things. Another essential question, in my opinion, is there any architectural model of socialist realism in this pre-war period? Designed and built as these events were unfolding between 32 and 34, the Neo-Palladian house on Makhova by Ivan Zholtovsky stood as a provocation to the aesthetic of the avant-garde that had been all the rage until shortly before. Many scholars still identify this building and in the final project of the Palace of Soviets by Yafan and so on, the pure expression of Soc-realism. The Dom Namajuve's erudite revisitation of the Loggia del Capitano, in the line with the most rigorous Russian classicism developed in St. Petersburg after the First World War, such as the Markov residential building by Vladimir Shukov, was a statement to the vitality of the classic architecture and its capability to respond to the tasks required by the transformation. This work provided a supreme lesson in execution as well, and was an interpretation of what housing for the elite, the very focus of the housing strategies in the 30s, the so-called Dama ITR, via specialista fi ingegnera fi tagliare. And more in general, what a building that aspired to speak the language of monumentality could be. It was not, in any case, the reference model in a framework characterized by eclecticism and eclectic approach. Just few images to comment this point. These are images of what happened in the same year in Moscow, in Leningrad. It's wonderful. This is the dome, the housing dome for the Len Soviet, and so on. Just in Kiev, just in the same year, Melnikov expressed itself as a social realist architect, and so on. The army, the Red Army, the metro directional station, and so on. The panorama was in any case driven by diverse declination, theoretical and practical needs that embraced both a number of forms of classicism, but also other stylistic perspectives. In short, the reference to classicism was crucial, of course, pivotal, but far from exclusive. There were also researches that were not in line with the widespread historicism and eclecticism, among other officially criticized, like the so-called formalism that was the cause for the condemnation of Melnikov's work. Just move on. This variety of currents is testified by a number of competition projects, such as those for the NKTP, the Heavy Industry Commissariat, as well as by completed buildings in Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, and so on. Even intense at times, the confrontation in terms of theory and design between the different creative orientation, only superficially banned by the debate, continued to manifest itself strongly without reticence up until the second half of the 30s. In this sense, the very example of the Soc-realism was the Metro of Moscow. The regime project par excellence, the worksite Pastalinsky, designed and built as the new currents were developing and consolidating. This work, complex and interesting, remains a highly eloquent example of those times and the very architectural translation of socialist realism in practice. From Ivan Leonidov's employment of the so-called use of so-called red Doric to Nikolai Ladovsky's stations, passing through the station designed by Nikolai Kolly or Alexei Dushkin, the stark difference in style that make up the infrastructure often combine in the same station in a sophisticated play of oppositions underlined the breadth of formal strategies that were both admitted and encouraged, and which underpinned the vision of realism in architecture up until the second half of the 30s. Just a few examples in the 30s. It was the social realism. Ladowski, of course. 2 minutes. Yes, of course. So, there is a still further aspect to be taken into consideration. The process of approximation to realism did not arrive in the 30s to establish a dogma, but anyway involved the whole Soviet culture. Part of the image of realism includes the transformations of languages and approaches that invested the different branches of design culture. It's the case for constructivists. For example, with a series of papers on scientific journals and disciplinary journals from Architettura SSR to Literaturne Gazzetta, published between 33 and 34, the leaders of constructivism had tried to define the keys of a possible approach, a rationalist approach to realism. They don't deny the relationship with tradition, but rejected the use of the forms of the past in contemporary architecture according to an attitude of eclecticism, which was also widely stigmatized in different locations, in different places and pages of the official press. But just to have a conclusion, this change was not in theory but also in the practical work of Ginsburg and so on, but what seems to me important, the very important issue of this attempt was represented by Leonidov. The much more is in Leonidov that we can see the attempt to materialize many of these indications, demonstrating the feasibility of a new palette of architecture. The project of the Ministry of Heavy Industry that you see in this beautiful exposition suggested, compared to the early works, a new and highly original vision, even if we find preserved some characteristic features of the project developed by Leonidov in the 20s. Traits of continuity between the Institute Lenin and the Narkomtyesh Prom are, for example, the clarity of composition, and so on. On the other hand, the richness of the formal palette, the details, the chromatic sensitivity, the attention paid to urban landscape, and the relationship between old and new, the reflection on the polyphonic sources of tradition, all of these elements place precisely this work in the context of the debate on the socialist rails in the mid-30s. The project was trying to demonstrate how the inheritance should not have, the heritage should not have superficially used but assimilated, critically assimilated, and how this could happen outside a narrow historicist and eclectic vision. The project sought to show how the relationship with tradition and history did not imply a collection of quotations, but meant a deep understanding of the mechanism of building space, and so on. It represented a possible interpretation of the socialist realism. So, thank you very much.